I am the Swarm. Author, Quantum Wizard. Chapter 111, The Strange Fish. Using echolocation, Luo Wen determined that the attackers were 4 fish, each approximately 30 centimeters in length. He relaxed slightly. The numbers were small, and their size didn't give them an advantage. Where did they find the courage to challenge him? As the attackers swiftly approached, Luo Wen finally got a clear view of them. They had disproportionately large heads and slender tails. Their bodies were dark grey with crescent-shaped red markings, and their mouths were filled with densely packed, razor-sharp teeth, exuding an oppressive aura. Unfortunately for them, they had encountered the ever-prepared Luo Wen. As one strange fish neared, a massive pincer snapped at it. Though the pincer appeared cumbersome, its speed was lightning fast, creating a trail of white water ripples beneath the surface. The strange fish was highly agile, twisting its body to evade the pincer. However, a limb shot out from the shadows, piercing its body from the side. In an instant, red blood began to diffuse through the water. The 3 fish trailing behind caught the scent of blood. Instead of continuing their assault on Luo Wen, they turned on their injured companion, tearing it apart. Within moments, the wounded fish was reduced to shreds, fragments of flesh, scales, and limbs floating in the water. This sudden development left Luo Wen momentarily stunned, and the follow-up attacks he had prepared lost their targets. But what happened next gave him no time for shock. Just seconds after the blood spread, a torrent of abnormal vibrations emanated from the depths of the river. It seemed the blood had disturbed something, and countless vibrations raced toward his location. From the feedback he received, Luo Wen discerned that they were all the same type of strange fish. The small area around him was about to turn into a battlefield. This was an internal conflict among the strange fish, and as an outsider, Luo Wen decided not to get involved. Realizing the 3 remaining fish were no longer interested in him, he quickly swam away. After covering a dozen meters, the water behind him began to boil. Dense, frothy waves surged across the surface. Luo Wen had no interest in looking back. After swimming another 50 meters, he cautiously poked his head out near the riverbank. The commotion behind him expanded rapidly, and Luo Wen's swimming speed was too slow to guarantee his safety for long. If the chaos spread further, he might still get caught in it. Compared to the strange fish with their menacing jaws, the flying bugs now seemed almost endearing. Faced with a choice between regular danger and extreme peril, the decision wasn't difficult. Fortunately, Luo Wen had already gained some distance, and the flying bugs seemed distracted by the turmoil on the water's surface. Moreover, his impromptu bath had washed away most of the pollen particles. Luo Wen slowly climbed ashore, his form gradually blending into his surroundings. Only the hovering water droplets and occasional drips betrayed his movements. But now, no one was paying attention to him. Grateful for the respite, Luo Wen darted into the jungle, disappearing from sight. The environment around him was familiar, traces of his pheromones lingered. He had scouted this area days ago and remembered a burrow of tail-lard rats nearby where he could rest temporarily. As for the tail-lard rats? T/N, I'm guessing he ate them? It's not really clear in the source material. The burrow was spacious enough for Luo Wen. The foul stench from before had mostly dissipated over the past few days. His recent exertions had drained a significant amount of his energy, though with his tail-lard organ, such consumption was negligible. Closing his eyes, Luo Wen sank his consciousness into his mind, uploading the newly acquired flying bug genes to the swarm network. This was a feature he had discovered recently. He could back up his genetic data to the network, with only him and the brood nest having download permissions. It was like switching from local storage to cloud storage. This function saved him a lot of trouble. He no longer needed to return to the base each time he acquired new genes to link with the brood nest for sharing. After completing the upload, he began analyzing the flying bug genes. Now that he could actively select his evolutionary traits, he no longer passively accepted every new ability but instead could pick and choose. For instance, from earlier genetic acquisitions, he had only opted for thermal sensing and echolocation, discarding others like web spinning. While web spinning seemed flashy, it required a new gland to be added to his body. Apart from the toxin glands near the base of his teeth, his abdomen already housed the Gatling system. The Gatling system consisted of 2 glands storing different chemical compounds in a reaction chamber, taking up most of his abdominal space. Not to mention the recently added tail-lard organ. Adding a new gland would require reducing his Gatling ammunition capacity, which was impractical. After careful consideration, Luo Wen realized his interest in web spinning was largely influenced by movies. In reality, the ability required extensive preparation and wasn't nearly as miraculous as portrayed. Thus, Luo Wen abandoned it. Many of the abilities he discarded were for similar reasons, like feathers. There was simply no place on his body for such things. As he encountered more species, the diversity of his abilities proved adaptable. However, sometimes having too many abilities wasn't advantageous. Many traits required corresponding structural adaptations. For instance, his ability to fly relied on anti-gravity wing cover technology because his bulky body couldn't achieve flight otherwise. Birds and pterosaurs, by contrast, had streamlined forms optimized for flight. Similarly, his swimming could only be described as not drowning compared to the speed and agility of fish. Even his echolocation system, derived from bats, fell short. Bats had large ears as receivers, while he had only 2 small ear holes. The performance gap was self-evident. Perhaps the only system in which he surpassed the original was his Gatling mechanism, where his size provided a clear advantage. But that didn't obscure the shortcomings of his multi-trait approach. Despite these thoughts, Luo Wen wasn't about to abandon his multi-talent strategy. It had proven crucial to his adaptability and survival in varied dangers. As the swarm's supreme commander, Luo Wen's primary task was survival. For him, multiple talents were the right choice. However, his musings weren't about himself but about the future of the swarm. Should he develop soldiers with versatile abilities or specialize them for specific tasks? He had begun to feel the limits of his knowledge and intellect. Yet, there wasn't much he could do about it. The Queen Ant resembled an intelligent AI, capable of receiving commands but not holding discussions. Fortunately, their current enemies weren't particularly strong. With the swarm's unique abilities and sufficient resources, overcoming them shouldn't be a problem. This thought circled briefly in Luo Wen's mind before he set it aside. Chapter 112, Diplodocus and Leopard. The new flying bug genes weren't particularly useful for Luo Wen himself. However, their template made them suitable for mass production, potentially filling the gap in the swarm's aerial forces. Perhaps soon, the first tree-based sub-base of the swarm would be officially established. Still, some revelations in the genetic data caught Luo Wen by surprise. The flying bugs had indeed tracked him using pollen but not through scent. Instead, the pollen, mixed with saliva, created a unique refractive effect. This allowed the flying bugs to accurately pinpoint him even amidst dense vegetation and blooming flowers. In hindsight, the Gatling smoke barrage wasn't effective because of its smell but because the rising white smoke obstructed their vision. It was a lucky accident. Without understanding this mechanism, relying solely on scent to counter them in the future might have led to disastrous outcomes. Now somewhat rested, Luo Wen didn't feel like stopping. Although the earlier chase seemed perilous, he hadn't been injured. After lingering a bit longer, Luo Wen crawled out of the burrow, intending to continue exploring. As he followed the river downstream, the forest gradually became sparser. He had scouted this area days ago and had traced the source of the vibrations he had sensed earlier. Thanks to multiple rounds of genetic integration, his field of vision was now comparable to his human days. Moreover, his close-range clarity had improved significantly. Thus, Luo Wen spotted the massive creature from afar. It was a colossal beast, and there was no exaggeration in calling it such. It resembled a diplodocus from Earth, with a body length exceeding 30 meters, a shoulder height of 7 to 8 meters, a tiny head, and robust limbs. While its body was enormous, its neck stretched 7 to 8 meters, and its tail extended about 15 meters. Its main torso wasn't that large, but even so, its estimated weight exceeded 10 tons. Each step it took reverberated like thunder. Judging by its simple head and uniform teeth, it was undoubtedly a herbivore. This was confirmed after Luo Wen observed it for a long time. Aside from munching on leaves, it displayed no predatory behavior. That made sense. With its size and structure, it was no sprinter. Its long neck would make catching even a tail-lard rat a struggle. Luo Wen suspected the sparse vegetation in the area was likely the result of its voracious appetite. Although it was the largest creature Luo Wen had encountered, it posed no threat to him. Knowing the source of the vibrations had greatly boosted his sense of security and even helped him sleep better. After all, the unknown was always the most frightening. Despite its harmlessness, Luo Wen didn't approach it recklessly. The food source was simply too large, he couldn't possibly consume it all before it began to rot. For now, it was better to leave it be. The creature wasn't likely to stray far with abundant food nearby. After circling the forest edge and finding nothing new, Luo Wen decided to return to the base. Since gaining remote control via the swarm network, he hadn't visited the base in some time. Over this period, especially after the Type 3 Queen Ant entered production, the swarm had experienced explosive growth. They now controlled nearly half of the big-headed ant's nest. It wouldn't be long before they wiped out the big-headed ants entirely and took full control of the area. However, the swarm's current force composition was imbalanced. Besides worker ants, there were only assassin-type spy ants, with a glaring lack of frontline soldiers. Previous head-on strategies were no longer viable in the current situation. The tracking systems of the ant-based bugs were also outdated. Against fast-moving targets like tail-lard rats or small dinosaurs, they were at a clear disadvantage, not to mention the all-aerial flying bugs and various bird species. The swarm urgently needed new unit types to establish an integrated air-ground cooperative combat system. Yet, with resources and production capacity still catching up, Luo Wen had time to deliberate on unit combinations. As he contemplated this on his way back, his sharp eyes caught an unusual movement above and to the side. Snapping out of his thoughts, Luo Wen focused on the sight. On a thick branch just beneath the canopy, a leopard-like creature crouched in an attack stance. The creature measured about 2 meters long, slightly larger than a tail-lard rat. Its body was well proportioned, with muscular limbs that exuded agility. Its yellow fur was adorned with black ring patterns, and it had a small head, a long tail, and razor-sharp claws. Its target wasn't Luo Wen, whose optical camouflage was now practically a passive skill, continuously active. Despite his mishap with the flying bugs, the system still proved invaluable in fooling most visually oriented predators. A quick glance to the side revealed the leopard's target, a bird-like creature about 30 centimeters in length. The bird's plumage was vibrant, and Luo Wen knew from experience it tasted great. He had eaten plenty before. The thought made him slightly hungry. That massive Diplodocus was beyond his capacity, but the leopard should be manageable, and it came with the bonus of fresh genetic material. The leopard must have been new to the area. Its sudden appearance meant the local birds, accustomed to a predator-free life, were somewhat naive. After several moments of patient stalking, the leopard finally found the perfect position. It pounced, pinning the preening bird. Just as it lowered its head to enjoy its prize, an opportunist approached silently. The leopard, with its assassin-like nature, was highly vigilant. Hearing a faint noise, it froze, twitching its ears. The movement was obvious to Luo Wen, whose high refresh rate vision captured it instantly. He stopped in his tracks, stabilizing his optical camouflage. The leopard scanned its surroundings for a long time but found nothing. Pretending to yawn, it remained tense, its sharp gaze combing the area. Luo Wen couldn't help but admire its cleverness, though its performance was too deliberate. If it were in a talent show, it wouldn't make it past the preliminaries. After a while, failing to detect anything amiss, the leopard finally let its guard down. It lowered its head again, just as its jaws opened wide. Suddenly, a gust of wind howled. The leopard reacted too late, feeling a heavy weight slam onto its back and a sharp pain at its neck. Though the leopard's body was several times larger than Luo Wen's, it was lean and lighter in weight. Pinned by the sudden weight and increasing pain at its neck, the leopard struggled fiercely, growling threateningly. However, it was perched 20 meters high in the canopy. Though the branch was thick, it lacked space for a full-blown fight. With a series of pitiful cries, the leopard tumbled from the branch, Luo Wen clinging to its back. Mid-fall, it cunningly twisted to ensure its back landed first, attempting to use Luo Wen as a cushion. But Luo Wen, a self-proclaimed quadrupedal amphibious soldier, planted his legs firmly on the leopard's back and propelled himself away. In that split second, he even used a limb to snatch the bird from the leopard's claws. The two separated as they fell. Luo Wen's wing covers snapped open, membranous wings unfurling to stabilize his descent. The leopard, however, was merely a tree-climbing terrestrial predator. It hit the ground hard, looking up at Luo Wen in shock. Chapter 113, Developing New Frontline Units. The fall from such a height wasn't fatal for the leopard, but Luo Wen's venom certainly was. After hitting the ground, the leopard struggled to get up and flee, but the pain in the back of its neck intensified. Its muscle tissues dissolved, its nervous system broke down, and its body lost control, leaving it to collapse helplessly on its side, howling in agony. To avoid attracting other competitors, Luo Wen didn't let it suffer long. He dove down from above, pincers outstretched, silencing the leopard forever. It took a great deal of effort and time, but Luo Wen finally consumed both the leopard and the bird, bringing their fatal rivalry to an ironic resolution in his stomach. Satisfied and full, Luo Wen temporarily lost interest in further excitement. The rest of his journey back to the base was uneventful, and he arrived without issue. Back at the base, the number of fully developed insects had surpassed 1 million. However, there were nearly 10 million eggs and larvae still maturing. This was because the second batch of 50 Type 3 queen ants had matured late, and their first batch of offspring wasn't yet fully developed. It would take a few more days. But Luo Wen's primary purpose in returning wasn't the offspring but the queen ants themselves. Although these weren't the command-specialized Type I queens, their intelligence was still slightly higher than that of ordinary bugs. They could help Luo Wen test additional functions of the swarm network. Since the swarm network had been established, Luo Wen noticed a significant rise in the insect's intelligence, especially among the queen ants. This was likely because communication within the swarm network resembled telepathic exchanges. Things that were previously impossible to explain were now understood with minimal effort. Perhaps this was the essence of comprehension beyond words. Within Luo Wen's mental space, the number of nodes had increased by hundreds or thousands of times compared to before. Suddenly, one of the nodes began to flash brightly. Luo Wen focused his thoughts, linking to the node. His consciousness descended, and a quick glance confirmed it was the perspective of a queen ant he had previously tested. Several tests followed, switching between different queen ants without any errors. The accuracy of node connections was 100%. The swarm network truly lived up to its reputation as an interactive system. Apart from the lack of a ringtone, it was almost like a video call. Luo Wen also discovered an important piece of information: queen ants did not naturally gain command over other insects. Since the Type 3 queens were mainly tasked with production and because the insect population was still relatively small with only one base, Luo Wen himself handled most of the command tasks. If this had been a Type I queen, the issue might have been noticed earlier. However, this didn't mean the queen ants couldn't lead. They simply required Luo Wen's authorization. Through the swarm network, Luo Wen could establish various hierarchical levels, each granting different degrees of authority. In a given area, higher-ranking insects could command those of lower rank. They could even issue orders directly through the swarm network. This was far more efficient than the pheromone-based command system previously used by the queens. It also acted as a unique friend or foe identification system. Luo Wen surmised this was an upgraded version of the brood nest's original identification system. It ensured that no other organisms could infiltrate or exploit the swarm. Still, Luo Wen wasn't planning to abandon other identification methods. The swarm network needed external safeguards as well. Perhaps, someday, overconfident infiltrators would think they had bypassed the swarm's defenses, oblivious that every insect around them had already identified them. That thought alone was amusing. Although it seemed like Luo Wen was overthinking or outsmarting the heir, who could predict the future? With his lifespan no longer limited, there were countless days ahead. For now, Luo Wen granted the Type 3 queen ants a basic level of authority, just slightly higher than ordinary bugs. While the swarm network's hierarchical system could support more complex management structures, this feature was overly advanced for the current state of the swarm. The queens, mass-produced on an assembly line, were closer to intelligent ace without subjective consciousness. For now, one level of hierarchy sufficed. This restored the familiar command system of the swarm but equipped every insect with a phone. Simultaneously, Luo Wen took the opportunity to re-evaluate the swarm's military composition. In the past, the swarm consisted of two-dimensional units, with soldiers measuring only 20 to 30 centimeters being considered ultra-sized. But now, the creatures he encountered often measured over a meter, with some, like the 30-meter-long Diplodocus, being colossal. Slow-moving, outdated soldier ants were no longer suitable for the swarm's development. If the swarm could return to its pre-hibernation scale, it would dominate easily unless these terrestrial creatures learned to fly, swim indefinitely, and never return to land. Otherwise, they would all become food. Back then, even strong enemies like the Yellow Earth Ant Legion were exceptional, with millions in number being a big deal. But now, big-headed ants were at the bottom of the food chain. Birds, long-faced beasts, and tail-lard rats, all seemingly weak creatures, included big-headed ants in their diets. Relying solely on the ant template to conquer the world was now exponentially more difficult. Moreover, Luo Wen had already beaten the game using the ant template once. Repeating the same strategy would be uninteresting. Luo Wen's ambitions weren't grand. Years of solitude had left him with little beyond survival and the pursuit of distractions to stave off mental collapse. The conclusion was clear: Luo Wen needed to upgrade the swarm's military units to better adapt to the current environment. During his unknown duration of hibernation, his abilities had reached an incredibly advanced level. The ability to choose genetic evolutions was just the foundation. He could now assimilate genes from not only insects but also amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. As long as there were no fundamental conflicts, he could combine them freely. Additionally, Luo Wen could even collect genetic material from plants and fungi. While animal and plant genes were difficult to integrate, he had no such issues combining plant and fungal genes. This meant that, with enough time and experimentation, he could enhance the crops within the ant nest to improve their yield and adaptability. For instance, he could make them more productive or better suited to various environments. Chapter 114, The New Main Combat Species, 1. The matter of crop improvement wasn't a high priority and could be left for later when there was more free time to study it leisurely. With the swarm steadily expanding in size, it was about to step into the limelight and face various challenges. Luo Wen's urgent task now was to determine the primary combat species for the upcoming period. But the question remained: what kind of biological template should be chosen? Continuing to use the ant template wasn't impossible. Adding an advanced detection system, equipping it with a powerful heart, overhauling its nutrient supply system, and enhancing its mobility were all feasible modifications. However, there was one critical, unsolvable problem: the exoskeleton armor. The exoskeleton not only made ants into powerhouses but also improved their defensive capabilities. Yet, the exoskeleton was both a blessing and a curse. Despite its numerous advantages, the exoskeleton inherently restricted the size of the ants. If they wanted to grow larger, they had to go through repeated molting. Take their colossal variant, the ultra-giant soldier ant, for example. To reach its full size, it had to molt twice this for a body size of merely 20 to 30 centimeters. Luo Wen himself couldn't even recall how many pupations and molts he had undergone to grow to a body length of 60 centimeters. Molting was an energy-intensive and risky process. The solution was straightforward: extend their larval phase. By directly modifying their genes to allow the larvae to grow to the desired size before a single final molding, the need for repeated molting could be eliminated. However, growing a larva to over half a meter in length would consume an enormous amount of time and resources. Larvae had no productive capabilities, poor combatability, and even required worker ants to assist in feeding them. Maybe the swarm could afford such larvae in the future, but with its current scale, it couldn't support even a few. And the swarm thrived on numbers. What use were just a handful of large soldier ants? Other templates, such as small dinosaur-like creatures, tail-lard rats, or long-faced beasts, didn't face the exoskeleton's size limitation, but their combat effectiveness didn't justify their resource consumption. The leopard template? That was feasible, but the swarm didn't have the resources to rear more than a few. What Luo Wen needed was a combat species that was both powerful and cost-effective. After much deliberation, he thought of the transport bug. These creatures, modeled after cliff spiders, were initially created as auxiliary units due to their speed and impressive load-carrying capabilities. However, they also boasted considerable combat power, having earned accolades in numerous battles. Their piercing attacks were like reapers for smaller combat units. Their multi-jointed legs allowed them to traverse obstacles effortlessly, with remarkable gripping ability that enabled them to scale sheer, glass-like rock faces with ease. This made them well suited to most harsh battlefield environments. Although they also had exoskeletons and required one molt during their growth, Luo Wen could genetically modify them to remove the exoskeleton on their main body, retaining it only on their legs. This wouldn't leave their bodies defenseless, as Luo Wen planned to incorporate genes for tough skin and steel-like fur to bolster their protection. Moreover, they rarely fought alone. During hunts, numerous companions would provide mutual support, so the slight loss in defense shouldn't pose a significant issue. This modification freed their bodies from the limitations of the exoskeleton. With the weight reduction from the absent main body armor, they would become even more agile. As their body size increased, only the leg exoskeletons would need periodic replacements, significantly reducing energy consumption and associated risks. Luo Wen also planned to add a small venom gland at the tip of each leg, hiding a stinger for enhanced attack power. This upgrade would not diminish their combat capabilities; instead, it would greatly improve them. Additionally, he would incorporate an echolocation system into them. This would allow these new spider combat bugs to locate enemies more swiftly and accurately in jungle environments, better showcasing their potential. He also intended to modify their dietary systems, shifting them from carnivorous to omnivorous. This had been an idea Luo Wen had entertained for a long time, but he hadn't had the ability to implement it until now. Furthermore, they would be equipped with hibernation and tail lard genes. In Luo Wen's vision, these new spider combat bugs would be about 30 centimeters in size. A small portion would remain active, subsisting on an omnivorous diet to meet daily needs and maintain the swarm's vigilance. The majority, however, would either feed on dirt or enter hibernation until war broke out. Only during high-intensity conflicts would they be supplemented with meat for energy consumption. The tail lard gene would allow them to carry additional supplies under certain circumstances, fulfilling special wartime needs. Initially, Luo Wen had considered adding an optical stealth system to them, but upon further investigation, he found the cost to be exorbitantly high. The system essentially added a special nanostructure to the surface of the organism, effectively transforming their entire bodies. The energy consumption was staggering. After some thought, Luo Wen decided that since the spider combat bugs would be the primary combat species for the foreseeable future and would mainly engage in group battles, stealth wasn't particularly necessary. In the end, Luo Wen drafted a template for spider combat bug, modified, which included the optical stealth system for limited production as a special operations unit. With the primary combat species established, he turned to the auxiliary species. The ultra-giant soldier ants, based on the ant template, would still need to be produced. Their size could even be increased to a range of half a meter to a full meter. Given the spider combat bug's defensive limitations, they would need heavily armored infantry to hold the line in direct confrontations. With the ground forces mostly sorted, the next focus was the Air Force. This was a completely new venture for the swarm, one with no prior experience. Fortunately, Luo Wen had gained ample insight recently, giving him a rough idea of what to do. Currently, there were 3 candidate templates for the Air Force: flying insect genes, flying beetle genes, and bird genes. First, flying beetle genes were eliminated. Their body structure made them extremely inefficient at flying. Luo Wen suspected that their evolution of flight wasn't for combat but simply a workaround for their clumsy terrestrial movement. However, their flight mechanism was highly advanced, and Luo Wen believed they would have their moment to shine, just not now. Next, bird genes were dismissed. It all boiled down to cost-effectiveness. While a single 30-centimeter bird could easily take down a flying insect of similar size, the resources needed to produce one bird could create 10 or even dozens of 10-centimeter flying insects. One bird was no match for 10 flying insects. It might fight to the death and kill most of them, but if it were 10 birds versus 100 flying insects, the birds likely wouldn't even have the chance to fight to the death. Although birds had superior flight capabilities and endurance, those weren't currently needed. Besides, Luo Wen had better alternatives in mind for such roles in the future. Chapter 115, The New Main Combat Species, 2. The swarm's first batch of aerial units would use the flying insect template, divided into 2 versions, Type I and Type II. Type I closely adhered to the original template, with the only significant addition being an echolocation system. Their primary roles on the battlefield included aerial reconnaissance, target acquisition, marking, and interception. With the swarm now equipped with a real-time communication system, it was crucial to fully leverage it to achieve true coordinated combat. Type II flying insects, on the other hand, would incorporate some genes from the fart bug. These were slightly larger than Type I, with their abdominal poison sacs replaced by storage sacs and their tail stingers swapped for small cannon-like appendages capable of firing viscous toxin projectiles. The fart bug, due to its limited mobility and range, was no longer suitable for the current version of the swarm. Type II flying insects were designed as their replacements. The role of Type II on the battlefield was to provide aerial fire support and precision strikes. Though their attacks targeted single units, their significantly lower production cost compared to fart bugs meant that their numbers could compensate for this limitation. The original fart bugs would also cease production due to their mobility issues, susceptibility to terrain, high cost, and limited firing angles. Additionally, their commander, the Type I queen ant, would undergo some modifications. A pair of membranous wings and an optical stealth system would be added to adapt to new combat scenarios. 2 days later, the swarm established its first tree-based sub-base, which was officially inaugurated on a nearby tree trunk. 2 Type III queen ants were sent to develop the new base. Given their initial lack of available combat units, some worker ants were dispatched to handle their feeding, nest building, and daily maintenance. The quick establishment of the Air Force Base was made possible by Luo Wen's discovery of a new skill, updating the gene libraries of queen ants through direct physical contact. This meant the swarm no longer needed to produce a new batch of queens every time it acquired new genes. However, the drawback was the necessity of physical contact to perform these updates. For now, while the swarm's territory remained small, this wasn't a major issue. But if it expanded to its previous scale spanning thousands of kilometers with tens of thousands of queen ants, Luo Wen would have little time for anything else. Thus, Luo Wen began experimenting with the swarm network's cloud storage functionality. If he could master its mechanisms, he could potentially update gene libraries remotely via the swarm network in the future. If successful, this would make operations much more convenient. With the base arrangements completed, Luo Wen found himself temporarily idle, prompting a desire to wander outside. Staying in the base all the time was a severe drain on the swarm's resources, given his voracious appetite. Over the next period, Luo Wen roamed the forest, steadily expanding his exploration range. While feeding himself, he wasn't merely aimlessly wandering. Ever since discovering his ability to absorb plant genes, he had started consciously observing unusual plant species. Though he hadn't yet figured out how to harness this ability fully, he was already on the lookout for peculiar flora. The forest, with its incredible biodiversity, offered plenty to discover. Luo Wen found many fascinating examples, such as carnivorous plants. These plants created various traps with their bodies, some spread open like jaws, others formed pitcher-like structures, and still others utilized sticky secretions. They preyed on insects, while certain larger flower-like species could even capture small animals. Some species digested their prey remarkably quickly. For instance, a certain flower-like plant could completely digest a small animal in just one night. Fungi also became a collection focus for Luo Wen, as the swarm already had extensive experience cultivating them. Despite their strange appearances and diverse environmental requirements, fungi offered significant potential. Some grew directly on tree trunks, others on the ground, underground, or even on rocks, opening Luo Wen's eyes to previously overlooked possibilities. Algae were also within the scope of his collection. As one of the most ancient plant types, their continued survival and prosperity over millennia demonstrated their considerable evolutionary advantages. Beyond plants, Luo Wen encountered many novel creatures. The vast forest was teeming with life, and the number of species was overwhelming. Insects, naturally, were the most abundant. Though relegated to the bottom of the food chain, their sheer numbers ensured their survival. Despite this abundance, most insects had only mundane traits, with only a few possessing abilities that caught Luo Wen's attention. For example, a large golden beetle boasted a highly durable, spike-covered exoskeleton and a long, conical spiraled horn on its head resembling a unicorn. While its practicality was debatable, its striking and imposing appearance made it incredibly cool. Luo Wen decided that once the swarm developed enough for him to delegate manual tasks, he would fashion himself some golden armor as a showpiece. Conversely, some insects were utterly unimpressive, with evolutionarily pointless traits. One insect species, for instance, had elongated, twisted exoskeletal structures that neither provided defense nor attack capability and were extremely unsightly. Initially assuming that such an abstract appearance must indicate some extraordinary ability, Luo Wen's repeated experiments revealed that it had no practical use other than being an eyesore. This challenged Luo Wen's understanding, as he had always considered insects the epitome of functional evolution until encountering this useless species. Besides insects, Luo Wen encountered numerous birds. Their sizes varied greatly, as did their coloration. Some had short, stubby beaks, others long and sharp, and some were both long and robust. Their songs ranged from melodious and soothing, like a crystal-clear stream flowing through the soul, to outright obnoxious noise pollution. The latter invariably ended up in Luo Wen's stomach, becoming sustenance for his wanderings. He also encountered various snakes. Smaller ones with vibrant patterns were generally venomous, using heat sensing to hunt prey, rendering optical stealth ineffective. Interestingly, Luo Wen discovered that while using his hibernation ability, his slightly stiffened and less flexible body could evade their heat sensing. Consequently, snake species had become frequent additions to his diet during this period. Some snakes, however, were massive, better described as pythons. Their enormous bodies and thick girths were astonishing. The largest one Luo Wen encountered measured over 20 meters in length, making it the second largest creature he had seen, second only to the Diplodocus. Covered in large, scaled armor, these creatures possessed immense strength, easily snapping tree trunks as thick as barrels. They posed a far greater threat to Luo Wen than the herbivorous Diplodocus. After assessing his own limitations, Luo Wen wisely chose to keep his distance from these formidable serpents. Chapter 116, Real Combat Drills, 1. The remaining creatures were primarily beasts and dinosaurs. The situation for beasts was rather awkward, as most of them occupied the middle to lower levels of the food chain. Even the stronger ones, such as leopards, primarily hunted small birds and various rodents. However, one creature deserved special mention: a species resembling wild boars. These creatures were about 2 meters long, stood approximately 90 centimeters tall at the shoulder, and had sturdy limbs, large ears, and a short tail. Their bodies were covered in black fur, with their backs adorned by a row of rigid bristles. Below that were layers of coarse hair, while the fur on their abdomens was relatively soft. Particularly noteworthy were their sharp, robust tusks protruding from both sides of their mouths. Combined with their muscular build, these creatures delivered a formidable charge with incredible destructive power. In addition, they would often roll in mud, coating themselves to enhance their defenses. They typically moved in groups, ranging from a dozen individuals to over 100. While their diet was broad and consisted mainly of plant matter, including branches, fruits, and roots, these wild boars were undeniably dominant within the forest, boasting strength far surpassing that of leopards. As for the other beasts, most were weaklings not worth mentioning. Next were the dinosaurs. Among them were some formidable entities at the top of the forest's food chain. From afar, Luo Wen spotted 2 dinosaurs, each about 15 meters long, engaged in a fierce battle for reasons unknown. One of the dinosaurs had a dark greenish-black body, resembling the Tyrannosaurus rex from movies. It stood about 6 meters tall, with a massive skull nearly 2 meters long. Its enormous head and unique jaw structure gave it a terrifying bite force, reaching an astounding 10 tons, with up to 20 tons of force at the rear of its mouth. Adding to this were its interlocking, razor-sharp teeth, its most formidable weapon. Its body was densely packed with muscles, its hind legs were extraordinarily thick, and its tail was robust and powerful. However, its disproportionately short and weak forelimbs detracted from its overall ferocious appearance. Even so, this dinosaur likely weighed over 10 tons, possibly even more than a 30-meter-long Diplodocus. Additionally, its body was covered with a thick keratinized layer, providing excellent defense. Its scars and bite marks indicated extensive combat experience. Its opponent was a dinosaur with a crimson body, adorned with black ring-shaped markings. It was slightly larger than the Tyrannosaurus rex but appeared leaner. Its head was relatively long and narrow, suggesting that its bite force might be inferior to the rex's. However, this crimson-striped dinosaur was more agile. While it also stood on 2 legs, its forelimbs were much more developed than the rex's, ending in sharp claws that provided significant offensive capabilities. In summary, the Tyrannosaurus rex was stocky and powerful, relying mainly on its teeth and tail as weapons. In contrast, the crimson-striped dinosaur was agile and flexible, boasting an additional weapon in its claws. The 2 dinosaurs fought back and forth, evenly matched. Luo Wen, who had approached stealthily, initially thought he could take advantage of the situation. However, to his dismay, the 2 behemoths, seemingly fighting fiercely, were merely sparring. After inflicting minor injuries on each other, they amicably parted ways, leaving Luo Wen empty-handed in his attempt to scavenge. The roars of these 2 titans echoed through the forest, demonstrating their immense power. However, despite their loud voices, they attracted few onlookers, a fact that made Luo Wen, an outsider, realize that these 2 were likely the apex predators of this forest. Sharing the same territory, these 2 would undoubtedly become obstacles to the swarm's development in the future. Yet Luo Wen wasn't overly concerned. Judging by their massive size, their food consumption must be astonishing. Perhaps, within 100 kilometers, there were only 3 or 4 such creatures. Against such immensely powerful but numerically inferior entities, the swarm had plenty of methods to turn them into nourishment. After wandering outside for some time, Luo Wen returned to find that the base had thoroughly taken over the big-headed ant's nest. However, the fungi produced by the nest weren't enough to sustain the swarm's continued growth. Fortunately, the first batch of 100 modified spider combat bugs had fully matured and reached combat readiness. 2 days later, after Luo Wen returned to the base and rested for a night, the swarm launched its first large-scale hunting operation in the forest. The expeditionary force consisted of 100 modified spider combat bugs, 20 Type I flying bugs, and 50 Type II flying bugs. The total force of fewer than 200 made this operation seem rather modest. But Luo Wen knew this was a brand new combat experience. If the new operational system succeeded, the swarm's expansion would face no bottlenecks in the near future, growing exponentially. Luo Wen personally commanded this operation, with all the queen ants observing and learning through the swarm network. A buzzing sound rose as 70 flying bugs took off from the airbase, joining the ground-based spider combat bugs as they advanced into the forest. 20 Type I flying bugs split from the main group, scattering forward in a dispersed formation. Using ultrasonic waves generated by their vibrating wings, they formed an invisible sonar net, vividly mapping everything within its coverage. As the net pushed forward, the expeditionary force discovered their prey. It was a group of small dinosaur-like creatures, numbering about a dozen. These creatures resembled birds more than traditional dinosaurs. Averaging over a meter in length, they had conspicuous red crests on their heads, long necks, short tails, and bodies covered with fine feathers. Their 2 forelimbs, sparsely adorned with feathers, appeared more decorative than functional. At the moment, they remained oblivious to the impending danger, gathered in small groups as they scratched the soil with their hind claws, searching for insect larvae buried beneath. Guided by aerial reconnaissance, the spider combat bugs swiftly positioned themselves. Within seconds, the small bird-like dinosaurs were simultaneously ambushed. The sky was a blind spot for these bird-like dinosaurs. Although they reacted quickly as the 30-centimeter-long spiders descended upon them, it was already too late. The spider combat bugs used the hooks and adhesive hairs on their legs to latch firmly onto the bird-like dinosaurs' backs. The seemingly defenseless creatures displayed unexpected tenacity. They twisted their long necks into impossible angles, using their sharp beaks to launch counterattacks at the spiders clinging to their backs. However, the spider combat bugs were not there to wrestle. Their multi-jointed legs allowed them to maneuver deftly across the dinosaurs' narrow backs, evading the beak's strikes. At the same time, they revealed their true weapon. Chapter 117, Real Combat Drills, 2. The stingers hidden within the hooks of the modified spider combat bugs had silently injected venom into the small bird-like dinosaurs during their brief contact. This venom was not the same as Luo Wen's own toxin. Its primary component was an extremely concentrated digestive fluid. Since the spider combat bugs stored their venom in small glands within their legs, the limited space meant these glands held only small amounts. Naturally, the venom capacity was insufficient for Luo Wen's standard digestive toxin, which required large quantities to be effective. This toxin wasn't purely a poison, it primarily served to digest food externally. Paralyzing and killing prey was merely a secondary effect. Thus, small doses of Luo Wen's toxin only caused intense pain without delivering fatal results. As the prey's size increased, its effectiveness further diminished. Given these limitations, the spider combat bugs couldn't rely on such a toxin. Instead, Luo Wen had combined the genetic traits of various venomous organisms, snakes, spiders, insects, and even a type of snail to create a new, potent toxin. This innovative venom acted as a powerful anesthetic while being highly lethal. Its mechanism was simple and effective. Once injected into prey, it immediately blocked the transmission of nerve signals. The prey's heart would stop beating, and its breathing would cease shortly after. The time required for the process varied depending on the prey's size and the amount of venom injected. For the small bird-like dinosaurs, it would take no more than 2 or 3 minutes. Once the venom was injected, the spider combat bugs avoided prolonged confrontation. After evading a sharp beak attack, they used their 8 legs to push off forcefully, leaping backward to disengage from the bird-like dinosaurs. One of the dinosaurs, enraged at the audacity of these 30-centimeter-long bugs, was about to pursue when its body suddenly went numb. Simultaneously, a concentrated barrage rained down from above, halting its advance. The small projectile struck its body, causing a searing pain akin to being burned. The dinosaur felt its body grow increasingly numb and unresponsive as the pain subsided. The other bird-like dinosaurs suffered a similar fate. Most were paralyzed on the spot, becoming helpless prey. A few, however, chose to flee rather than counterattack after being struck. Their escape was short-lived. The Type II flying bugs intercepted them with precision, ensuring they lost control of their bodies within moments. The battle had barely begun, and in just a few minutes, it was already over. Perhaps the opponents were simply too weak. The swarm's combat forces had barely demonstrated the effectiveness of their coordinated air-ground tactics before the enemy fell. In fact, only about a dozen spider combat bugs had participated in the fight, while the rest merely observed. Luo Wen felt somewhat unsatisfied, the battle had ended before he could fully engage. It was like preparing for a game, warming up with stretches and finger exercises, only for the opposing player to quit immediately after the game started. No sense of fulfillment. Still, he was thrilled by the swarm's initial victory, which validated his current strategy. However, upon examining the prey, Luo Wen felt a bit frustrated. Though these bird-like dinosaurs were only about a meter long, their lack of tails meant their bodies contained a considerable amount of meat. By Luo Wen's estimation, each one weighed around 50 kilograms. The problem was that in developing the combat units, he had completely neglected the logistics units. The modified spider combat bugs, though originally capable of transport as earlier versions, required assistance from other insects to do so. They lacked the limbs necessary for efficient loading and unloading. The flying bugs, as aerial units, prioritized shedding any unnecessary limbs, making them unsuitable for transportation. If the new version of soldier ants were available, they could have temporarily served as laborers. However, their production was far down the sequence, with not even a single egg laid yet. With no time to rectify this oversight, the task of moving the prey fell to Luo Wen himself. His clawed limbs were well suited for gripping, and his exoskeletal armor endowed him with immense strength. After a long day of hard labor, he finally managed to transport all the prey back to the base. For the time being, they were buried in a pile of decaying leaves near the base. The burrower ants were assigned to work overtime, constructing a massive storage chamber. Leaving the prey exposed outside was too risky. Meanwhile, an order was placed for the first batch of 10 heavy armored soldier ants, each a meter long. These would require several dozen days to mature, undergoing a pupal stage for their final development. Once ready, the heavy armored soldier ants could temporarily serve as transport workers. Until then, Luo Wen would have to handle the job himself. Fortunately, this hunt yielded substantial gains. The few hundred kilograms of food would sustain the swarm for a while, assuming Luo Wen didn't consume it himself or venture out to find his own food. The combat units were ordered to retreat. With sufficient food on hand, continuing the hunt would only result in unnecessary killing and waste. A small contingent was assigned to maintain vigilance and patrol the area, while the rest entered temporary hibernation. Luo Wen, meanwhile, didn't linger at the base, heading out alone to forage. In this forest, Luo Wen's ability to obscure his presence, including his scent, pheromones, and heat signature, meant that only a few apex predators posed any threat. Moreover, with his superior detection abilities, even those few titans were no match if Luo Wen chose not to provoke them. As a result, Luo Wen now occupied a position at the top of the food chain in the forest. Hunting alone posed little danger, and he enjoyed a comfortable life, eating whatever he pleased. However, barely 2 days into his escapades, an urgent call came from the base. 2 queen ant nodes began flashing. Luo Wen, perched on a tree branch, immediately locked onto the signal and projected his consciousness. The mental exchange was swift, and Luo Wen quickly grasped the situation. The prey, stored outside temporarily while the storage chamber was under construction, had attracted trouble. Covered in decaying leaves and killed without visible wounds, the prey initially seemed secure. Yet, with the recent surge in larval production at the base, the underground plantation could no longer meet their needs. The queen ants had naturally dispatched worker ants to cut pieces from the prey to supplement the base's resources. While the worker ants made only small incisions, their sheer numbers gradually expanded the wounds. Inevitably, the scent of blood began to spread. Chapter 118, Storage Issues, 1. The stench of blood had drawn some keen-scented predators toward the swarm's base. They lurked, observed, and edged closer. But as soon as they crossed a certain perimeter, they were detected by the Type I flying bugs patrolling the skies. These bugs immediately relayed the situation through the swarm network to 2 queen ants stationed in nearby sub-bases. The queen ants, having received prior authorization to access the vision of lower-ranking insects, assessed the situation. However, unsure of how to proceed, they promptly escalated the matter to Luo Wen. The entire process happened swiftly. In fact, from the detection of the intruders to Luo Wen receiving the alert, less than 30 seconds had passed. Some of the cautious predators hadn't even moved from their positions. Switching to the perspective of an airborne Type I flying bug, Luo Wen observed the intruders. He quickly realized their caution stemmed from weakness. Though the creatures were varied in type, they shared a common trait: small size. The largest among them measured barely over 2 meters in length. Most were beasts with sturdy limbs, whether bipedal or quadrupedal, optimized for running. Their offensive and defensive capabilities were unimpressive. Based on Luo Wen's observations of the local ecosystem, most of these creatures were scavengers, feeding on plant and animal remains, nature's cleanup crew. Among them were tail-lard rats, which lacked the strength to hunt but eagerly sought leftovers, and smaller dinosaur-like creatures that occasionally hunted but didn't mind scraps. After scanning the group, Luo Wen concluded that none of them posed a serious threat. He returned the handling authority to the queen ants, instructing them to properly welcome the visitors. Since they had come all this way, they might as well stay for a while. The queen ants had proven adept at learning and mimicking. Although Luo Wen's last commanded battle had ended quickly, dozens of queen ants had been observing and exchanging insights. This situation presented a perfect opportunity to hone their skills against weaker opponents. It would also help train future queen ants, sparing Luo Wen from having to personally demonstrate every time. It was akin to learning to drive. Earlier learners would teach the newcomers. Returning his consciousness to his body, Luo Wen set off toward the base. While the battle itself didn't require his intervention, the subsequent task of transporting the spoils was his responsibility. By the time Luo Wen reached the base, the battle had been over for quite some time. Corpses of various animals lay scattered around the perimeter. This was despite the swarm's limited manpower, which prevented them from attacking all at once, scaring off many of the intruders. Even so, the resulting haul weighed over 2 tons. Luo Wen spent an entire day transporting it back to the base. During this period, 2 more waves of food delivery arrived. One group consisted of dog-like creatures with mottled black, white, and yellow fur that lacked any aesthetic appeal. Though small in stature, about a dozen of them arrived as a pack. They were muscular, fast, and had impressive stamina. Unfortunately for them, none of these traits mattered against the swarm's new venom. Interestingly, these mottled dogs had a unique jaw structure, boasting the strongest bite force Luo Wen had seen among beasts. Even leopards, slightly larger in size, paled in comparison. The leopards, however, excelled in short bursts of speed but lacked the endurance of these canines. Moreover, leopards were solitary hunters, though their tree-climbing ability allowed them to catch birds. Without this skill, they might not even compete with the dogs on land. Both species had genetic traits that complemented each other, offering potential as templates for creating a new combat organism. The base's surroundings were dotted with mountains of earth. Without large excavation units, construction of underground storage facilities progressed slowly. At this rate, it would be some time before the storage chambers were completed. Meanwhile, the accumulating prey presented a logistical headache. The current wave consisted mostly of small-time scavengers, but who could say when one of the area's apex predators might show up? The amassed food alone was enough to lure those top-tier creatures. Should he produce more burrower ants to speed up excavation? Yet burrower ants required a lengthy growth period, taking at least several dozen days to mature. Too many variables could arise in that time. Nonetheless, Luo Wen reluctantly placed an order for a few burrower ants, which would likely be completed alongside the heavy armored soldier ants. Even so, Luo Wen felt dissatisfied. This approach merely treated the symptoms, not the root cause. The current genetic reserves were no longer as scarce as they once were. With so many new genetic fragments recently collected and his capabilities enhanced several-fold, surely a better solution existed. He calmed himself and began recalling all the creatures he had encountered, analyzing which abilities might prove useful. The crux of the issue was the swarm's small size. Back when the swarm spanned 10 kilometers, they had managed to dispose of mountains of insect carcasses in no time. Of course, back then, no other creatures dared to covet the swarm's spoils. Reflecting on the past held little value. Luo Wen first considered the saliva preservation method used by worker ants, who had once mixed their saliva with formic acid to coat and preserve food. Though still effective, this method faced the same limitation, the swarm's small scale. Millions of worker ants were insufficient to process over 2 tons of food quickly. Moreover, their processing methods inevitably released a lot of scent, compromising safety. Luo Wen then contemplated other animal food storage methods. However, most creatures operated on a meal-to-meal basis, leaving them free of his current worries. Others, like tail-lard rats, had evolved specialized organs to store food internally. Yet such strategies held little relevance for this situation. Suddenly, Luo Wen thought of web-building spiders. Some spiders wrapped their prey in silk for preservation, periodically injecting venom to keep them subdued but alive. Luo Wen glanced at the already dead prey. This method was clearly impractical. Perhaps it could be tested in the future, but for now, none of the swarm's insects possessed silk-producing glands. Another spider type injected digestive enzymes into prey, turning their bodies into natural containers. Luo Wen had used this approach when processing the long-faced beast, but the dissolved muscle tissue required immediate consumption to prevent rapid decay. Chapter 119, Storage Solutions, 2. Furthermore, this method also emitted odors. Back then, every time Luo Wen held a private feast, he would use the Gatling gun to sanitize the surrounding area. Most critically, only Luo Wen currently possessed the ability to produce compressed digestive enzyme toxins within the swarm. The older version of transport bugs once had this capability, but after being upgraded into modified spider combat bugs, their venom was replaced with neurotoxins. Luo Wen's toxin gland was small, with limited reserves, making it impossible for him to take on this task, even if he did nothing else. But thinking about digestive fluids opened Luo Wen's mind to new possibilities. He recalled encountering carnivorous plants before. What if he could create a plant capable of quickly digesting prey while also being edible for the swarm? Such a solution would instantly resolve the problem. With this idea in mind, Luo Wen immediately set to work. Although he had a concept, extensive experimentation was necessary to make it a reality. Luo Wen had no prior experience manipulating plant genetics, so everything had to be explored from scratch. He began by combining the traits of several carnivorous plants to create prototypes, which he then instructed the brood nest to produce. The brood nest, powerful as always, generated seeds that even came with their own nutrient packs, sufficient to support the seeds during their initial growth phase. Finding a small patch of land near the base, Luo Wen planted the seeds. He had no idea how long they would take to sprout and could only wait patiently. In the days that followed, Luo Wen, engrossed with his new toys, lost interest in venturing out. Moreover, every day brought new scavengers trying their luck at the base, effectively delivering themselves to the swarm. The swarm now had an overabundance of food, so much that Luo Wen had to help consume some of it to avoid spoilage. He also took on the daily tasks of transporting, burying, cutting, cleaning up, and even sanitizing and deodorizing the leftovers. Time passed, and Luo Wen continued experimenting with new seed prototypes every day. The earliest batch of seeds had long since sprouted. Though they grew at varying speeds and exhibited the ability to digest prey, none met Luo Wen's expectations. The main issue was that the plants were not palatable. They focused solely on their own growth, without considering taste or nutritional value. Luo Wen speculated that his experimental approach might be flawed and decided to incorporate genes from edible plants. The first candidate he thought of was the white fungal crop grown in the underground farms. Rich in protein and with a sweet flavor, this fungus was one of Luo Wen's favorite foods. Unfortunately, the high-yield and tasty mushroom had long since been lost, with no seeds left. However, Luo Wen had recently gathered various mushroom samples from the forest. Many of these were toxic, but such poisons had little effect on Luo Wen, who would quickly evolve antibodies. What Luo Wen possessed, the swarm also possessed. Adding various fungal genes to the new seeds led to more diverse combinations. Taking it a step further, Luo Wen incorporated genes from various algae species. Eventually, the genetic complexity of these seeds surpassed that of many animals. Batch after batch of crops sprouted. Luo Wen carefully analyzed their traits, retaining beneficial qualities and discarding flaws, then used the insights to create new seed prototypes. The heavy armored soldier ants and scorpions had both been successfully produced a few days earlier. The heavy armored soldier ants, with a body length of 1 meter, nearly double Luo Wen's size, boasted extremely thick exoskeleton armor from a single cast molding process. Their robust and imposing appearance was undeniably striking. Their arrival relieved Luo Wen of his transportation duties. Tasks like cutting were no longer his responsibility, giving him more time to refine the seeds. As time passed, fewer and fewer invaders dared to approach the base. The steady disappearance of small predators in the area had turned it into an unspoken forbidden zone. Luo Wen even went so far as to deliberately spread the scent of blood, but the arrivals were sparse. During this time, the swarm thrived thanks to an ample food supply, steadily increasing in numbers. Between his experiments with plant genetics, Luo Wen also developed several new specialized soldier types designed to counter the apex predators of the area. Thus, when Luo Wen bled the prey to lure predators, he wasn't afraid of drawing these top-tier creatures. Fortunately, the swarm had stockpiled plenty of food, and hunting parties, now led by newly produced type I queen ants, regularly ventured out to hunt. Freed from food-related duties, Luo Wen continued to immerse himself in the study of plant genetics. Watching seeds born from various genetic combinations take root, sprout, and exhibit unique traits felt like an addictive game of lottery to Luo Wen. As the swarm's hunting range expanded, their food consumption increased. This eventually drew the attention of the area's apex predators. These top-tier creatures noticed the rise of a new, aggressive, and dominant force that consumed vast amounts of prey daily, putting pressure on their survival. Although Luo Wen had anticipated that apex predators would eventually confront the swarm, he hadn't expected the first visitor to be a giant python. This enormous snake, far thicker than a barrel and over 30 meters long, arrogantly approached the swarm's base. It raised its head high, flicking its forked tongue, its gaze filled with disdain. While Luo Wen had never encountered this particular python, he had seen many around 10 meters long. These massive snakes were covered in dense, smooth scales that provided robust defense and deflected attacks. The venomous stingers of the modified spider combat bugs were ineffective against these scales, unable to penetrate their defenses. Without penetration, even the strongest venom was useless. Luo Wen had long considered these snakes obstacles to the swarm's territorial expansion, using them as hypothetical enemies to develop countermeasures. Recently, specialized weapons designed to combat these pythons had been completed. Luo Wen hadn't yet gone looking for trouble, but the trouble had come to him instead. Though the 30-meter python was unexpected, Luo Wen was confident it would appreciate the gift he had prepared. Several spider combat bugs with visibly swollen abdomens emerged from the base. They differed slightly from standard spider combat bugs, featuring notably slender legs and thin exoskeleton armor that raised them slightly off the ground, giving them a more imposing appearance. These special bugs had an exceptionally long name: antipython and other large reptile-swallowing type biological suicide explosion spiders, or simply self-destruct spiders. Chapter 120, Toxic Explosions and the Giant Python. Once the self-destruct spiders emerged, they immediately moved past the swarm's ranks, with two heading straight toward the python. As they crawled, they gradually shifted into their running mode. Using their legs like gymnasts launching themselves into the air, they flipped and rolled forward. Their elongated limbs, bent like powerful slingshots, propelled them forward at speeds nearly double that of their usual crawling pace. Upon nearing the python, they leapt high, with their slingshots catapulting them into the air toward the snake's head. The python, in the middle of relishing its dominance, was caught off guard by this apparent act of self-sacrifice. Did these tiny creatures, awed by its majestic form, intend to pay tribute? Was this their way of currying favor? Despite its massive size, the python was incredibly agile. With a swift motion of its head, it precisely caught both self-destruct spiders. Measuring just 30 centimeters in length, the bugs were minuscule compared to the snake's enormous maw and were swallowed whole in one gulp. Sliding down the python's esophagus, the self-destruct spiders reached its stomach. The thin exoskeleton armor covering the self-destruct spiders offered little protection against physical damage. However, it was highly resistant to acid and corrosion, allowing them to survive the gastric acids for an extended period. Not that they needed it. The swollen abdomens of the self-destruct spiders housed not only 5 toxin glands filled with potent mixed toxins but also an almost complete Gatling gun system. Inside, 2 chemical chambers simultaneously injected their stored compounds into a reaction chamber. The chemicals immediately reacted violently. However, the reaction chamber lacked an exhaust outlet. When the internal pressure from the chemical reaction reached a critical point, the abdomen of the self-destruct spider exploded. Deadly heat and a torrent of toxins were released in all directions. Outside, the python, still basking in its triumph, suddenly let out an earth-shattering roar of agony. Its massive body writhed in pain, its abdomen convulsing as it attempted to regurgitate its meal. But the self-destruct spiders had long since detonated into fragments. Even if the snake could empty its stomach, there was nothing left to expel. Inside the python, the intense heat had scorched its stomach, allowing the toxins to infiltrate its system. As the snake thrashed, the toxins spread throughout its body. The paralyzing agents in the toxins momentarily dulled the python's pain, enabling it to clumsily lift itself and make a desperate attempt to flee. At this moment, some previously overlooked Type I flying bugs in the sky launched a concentrated assault. A hail of bullets rained down on the python's eyes. Though the attacks initially seemed ineffective, its eyelids closed to block most of the bullets. The projectiles were far more than mere kinetic weapons. They carried potent toxins and a strong adhesive. The bullets stuck to the eyelids instead of bouncing off, and their toxins began corroding the eyelid's surface. As more bullets adhered to its eyelids, the python's defenses were breached. The moment the toxins reached its eyeballs, the snake let out another heart-wrenching scream. No longer bothering to shield itself from the airborne attackers, the python barreled forward, crashing through the forest in a blind panic. Trees too thin to withstand its bulk snapped like twigs, showcasing the python's immense strength. Luo Wen regretted not deploying more self-destruct spiders earlier. If he hadn't been so stingy, the python might already be dead instead of still thrashing around. However, after such prolonged torment, the python was on its last legs. The toxins had spread throughout its body, and as it continued its desperate charge, its movements grew increasingly uncoordinated. In a final burst of effort, the python demolished another small patch of forest before collapsing lifelessly to the ground, its 30-meter-long body sprawled across the earth. The injured python had fled several kilometers from the swarm base before succumbing. Its final resting place lay 4 to 5 kilometers away, a result of its impaired vision causing it to repeatedly crash into trees. Otherwise, it might have made it 10 kilometers or more. Even 4 or 5 kilometers posed a logistical nightmare for Luo Wen. The python's body, weighing nearly 20 tons and heavier than a diplodocus, presented a colossal challenge for transportation. The entire force of heavy armored soldier ants was mobilized. These ants, far stronger than Luo Wen had anticipated, exhibited adaptations to support their massive forms. Their legs had thickened, and paired with their heavy exoskeleton armor and low-set chassis, they resembled miniature moving fortresses. Unfortunately, their limited mobility confined them to tasks like transportation. The heavy armored soldier ants used their enormous mandibles to grip the python's head muscles and began dragging it along. However, the head muscles couldn't bear the python's full weight. The ants frequently stopped to adjust their grip, leaving the python's head mangled within moments. Its scales and muscles were torn open, exposing the bone underneath. The ants hooked their mandibles into the eye sockets, jawbones, and other sturdy areas, finally gaining traction. The python's massive body flattened the ground as it was dragged, leaving a 2-meter-wide bloody trail that stretched for kilometers. The scent of blood wafted for miles. Even so, few predators dared to approach. The python's earlier roars had likely scared off any potential scavengers, much like how weaker creatures had avoided the T-Rex's battle with the black-ringed red dragon. Without interference, the heavy armored soldier ants brazenly dragged the python back to the base. Luo Wen, uninterested in overseeing the dismemberment, retreated to his experimental garden to continue tinkering with plants. Cutting apart such large prey was a task better suited to the heavy armored soldier ants, who were already experienced in such work. The python's body provided a timely solution to the swarm's dwindling resources. The ants cleared a large open area near the base to process the carcass, working in the open without any attempt to hide their activities. With no immediate threats in the vicinity and the successful hunt of the python bolstering their confidence, the swarm no longer saw a need to conceal their prey or bloodshed. Although Luo Wen's fascination with developing new crops now seemed unnecessary, it had become a personal obsession. Even if the current circumstances didn't demand it, he considered it an enjoyable way to pass the time.